Hello, Truman. Very, very happy to be with you here with you today for this very exciting talk. Many of you I haven't seen in a while yet, so we'll get to that in a few minutes, but we'll go right to business right now. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Tony Johnson, President and CEO of the Truman National Security Project and the Truman Center. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome Sherri Goodman to our fireside chat today, focused on her new book, Threat Multiplier, Climate Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security. Truman has a twofold mission: to advance progressive national security and foreign policy ideas rooted in democratic principles, and to build an inclusive community of diverse leaders who will shape the character, quality, and destiny of American leadership for decades to come. Truman leaders meet our nation's toughest national security challenges with innovative solutions, and we unite policy experts, veterans, frontline civilians, development, and political professionals to help Americans understand how national security intersects and affects their everyday lives. Sherri Goodman is a leader and a brilliant thinker in the best tradition of Truman. For more than 30 years, Sherri has been in the vanguard of the fight to help senior leaders understand and confront climate change, a planetary scale challenge that affects all of us and our national security. She is exactly the kind of leader Truman likes to brag about because her career and life's work is a reflection of what Truman is all about. It would be impossible to cover all of the incredible work Sherri has done throughout her amazing career, but let's zoom in on a few highlights. Sherri was the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. She founded the Center for Naval Analysis Military Advisory Board. She serves as the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. And if that wasn't enough, she is also a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. Most importantly, Sherri has transformed how we think about environmental impacts of climate change on national security and global stability, and pushed environmental and climate issues from the periphery to the core of our national security strategies. Sherri's book, Threat Multiplier, offers an inside look at how climate change is shaping the U.S. military's role in our strategically complex and competitive environment. Her book makes powerful arguments that demonstrate why climate change isn't a distant and abstract issue. Climate change is very much a challenge that must be confronted now, today. Why? Because climate change is a force that amplifies every existing threat, from intensifying hurricanes and wildfires to food and water insecurity to geopolitical instability, and the U.S. military is adapting accordingly. In the book, Sherri highlights how the military has evolved to confront these climate-driven changes, making environmental stewardship integral to military activities. And because Sherri and because, as Sherri writes, doing so is not only good for trees and turtles, it's also good for the health and safety of our troops and the communities they serve. The challenges amplified by climate change have multiplied into national security risks. Like a rope with many strands in constant tension, excuse me, these national security strands, be it to support U.S. diplomatic disaster relief and humanitarian assistance efforts, planning for war or war fighting, designing military facilities and base housing, ensuring our forces are trained, ready, and resilient for action in any environment, or broader issues of U.S. energy security. The strands are tightly woven together. If one of them weakens, the whole rope begins to fray. Sherri's work and her book remind us about the interdependence and fragility of our global systems, and how critical it is that we view climate change as more than an environmental issue, but that we take actions that demonstrate we understand it as a national security imperative. In doing so, we strengthen every strand of our national security rope into the essential lifeline that ensures decision makers responsible for America's national defense, economic resilience, and global stability can confidently meet the challenges ahead. Sherri's book, Threat Multiplier, is a must-read for anyone concerned about the future of security in an unpredictable world. She distills decades of experience and expertise into a compelling narrative, making clear that action now on climate change isn't just about protecting the planet, trees, and turtles. It's about safeguarding our national security and America's future. Today's conversation will delve into key themes from Sherri's book, especially about how our military has already adapted and can adapt to a future shaped by climate change. As someone who has served at the highest levels of the Department of Defense and had a front row seat to senior leader deliberations on these challenges, I'm excited to hear Sherri's perspective on how we can turn today's threats into tomorrow's opportunities. We are very fortunate to have Sherri as part of the Truman family and as a member of Truman's Advisory Council. Her leadership has been crucial to our work on national security innovation and essential to the work we are doing now to chart Truman's future. So, welcome, Sherri. Thank you for joining us today to talk about your work and your book. We are thrilled. And I think with that, I'm going to hand over the mic to Katie MacDonald, co-lead for the Truman National Security Project's Climate Impact Group, who will lead the discussion with Sherri. Katie, over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and hi, everybody. My name is Katie MacDonald. As Tony mentioned, I'm a security fellow with the Truman National Security Project and co-lead of our internal climate affinity group. I'm also co-founder and managing partner of Tailwind, my company, which is an advisory and investment firm focused on scaling climate adaptation solutions. It's an honor to be here with Sherri today. Before we dive in, I just want to note that if anyone has questions, we're going to try to squeeze a few of those in. So please put them in the chat. We'll take a look at those. And second of all, this session is being recorded for those of you interested in revisiting this content. With that, Sherri, let's get started. So, a number of us have read the book. It's incredible. Congratulations. I want to start with the following question. So in the book, you lay out an astounding, truly, number of ways that climate impacts our military preparedness and our national security. You quote Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in saying that there is little that the Department of Defense does to defend Americans that's not affected by climate change. Can you expound upon this and take us through the major threats that exist on the world stage for Americans and our national security where climate is concerned, and perhaps talk about some themes that we hear from you in the book about, like climate as a catalyst for conflict and or a petri dish for terrorism?
Okay, thank you so much, Katie. And Tony, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I just wish my mother had been listening to that. It was like brilliant. Okay. Perfect. A+ on intros. And a CEO should be very good at introducing people. So, okay, doing great job. Okay, hello, everybody. I know a bunch of you on here. I'm so glad to have this conversation with you, and I want to make it as interactive and useful to you. A number of you are already professionals in this space, so I want it to be helpful in advance. So, and thank you, Katie, for what you're doing. I really enjoy having this conversation with you. So, climate change is a threat multiplier. I mean, that's a term I coined in 2007 with the first CNA Military Advisory Board to assess the national security implications of climate change. And we could see even then, but now we see it almost every day, if not every week, if not every day, that climate is affecting our security around the world, a changing climate, and increasingly our forces and our military, our diplomatic forces, all of our forces and the private sector and civilians also called into this fray, if you will. So, the climate threat multipliers from temperatures that have risen in the Arctic, for example, 4 degrees above the global average norm, but all around the world, storms of greater intensity. We just had Helene and Milton, but we have the equivalents now happening around the world. Wildfires that know no season, prolonged drought, permafrost thaw and melt in the Arctic. All of these physical changes then lead into what we call kind of the secondary. Those first order effects lead to secondary effects that compound with weak governments, terrorist, enable terrorist recruitment, and other instability, health, food, water, energy. So let's just do maybe a couple of examples. In drought-stricken parts of Africa, places like Somalia and Syria, where farmers and herders previously lived peaceably. Now the land, because of water scarcity and shortage mismanagement, doesn't support the same populations. People move into the cities. The young male youth in particular become ripe for terrorist recruitment. It's led in places like Somalia to, the poor a culture that wasn't historically fishing, then became more fishermen. And then you remember the Captain Phillips movie where you had the young Somali pirates who really weren't trained fishermen at all. I mean, it was a sort of accurate depiction of how desperate people can become when they no longer have adequate access to food, water, shelter, and livelihoods. So that's a sort of petri dish for terrorism story we see replaying now multiple ways across particularly Africa and the Middle East. In the Arctic, we have a region that has opened up in our lifetime, a new ocean essentially, that's now more navigable. And Putin, for example, envisions a toll road for transportation across the shallow northern sea route that hugs the Russian coastline and from ports in Asia to ports in Europe, and is trying to monetize that route at the same time that he's nuclearizing and militarizing that region. So a region that previously was characterized by cooperation, even during the Cold War, has become one of increasing tension as Russian forces buzz our Nordic neighbors, or Russia and China conduct exercises off Alaska's coast, forcing fishermen to flee the area. Meanwhile, China has declared itself to be a near Arctic stakeholder and eyes a more open Arctic as access to Russia's energy, minerals, shorter shipping lanes, and maybe in the future fish, as fish stocks move more towards the poles with climate change and depleted and illegally fished fish stocks elsewhere in the world. In our own hemisphere, here in Latin America, a region that is been on the march to both democracy and more robust economic development, but it's highly threatened, particularly in Central America and the Caribbean islands, by the increasing ravaging effects of storms that then, like in parts of Africa, they're become less resilient. And so people are on the march of fleeing, of course, northward, and traditional livelihoods have been disrupted. And then it's a major source of the energy and minerals we need for the clean energy transition. So there's a whole new economic. China's very active in that region now as well. So we have a region that's both climate stressed, economically important, and with a number of malign actors, from strategic competition to narco-human and wildlife trafficking, all in the mix there. And then, of course, in the Indo-Pacific, we have strategic competition with China as the sort of pacing threat, we call it, for our military force posture. But at the same time, we have a shaping threat, really, of climate, with increasingly strong typhoons in some areas, with small Pacific islands that are existentially threatened by climate risk, where populations of Kiribati and Tuvalu, for example, have already made plans to move parts of their population to other locations when their atolls become inhabitable, or they lose fresh water. So our strategic engagement across that region has to account not only for China's growing influence in that region, but also to meeting the needs of those allies and partners. For some of them, it's the climate risk, climate resilient infrastructure, or how to maintain their exclusive economic zones in a vast maritime area when their small landmass is threatened. That becomes front and center of what they want from their partners and allies.
Amazing. Even in those remarks, Sherri, it's fascinating to hear, and you did a beautiful job of outlining this in the book, the way that climate intersects things like terrorism, migration, great power competition, military conflict. And once again, I think you just do a fantastic job of explaining this intersection between climate and security and threat multiplier. And thanks for that overview. Switching gears a little bit, obviously, that's a big theme of the book. One other theme of the book that I think is good to start with for people's awareness is this concept of the Pentagon and the DoD's leadership on this topic. In the book, you say, against all odds and in defiance of all stereotypes, one of the strongest forces in the fight against climate change is indeed the DoD. We know that you've had a storied career in this space, and you personally compelled a lot of that leadership. Tell us a little bit about your experience doing that and about what obstacles you had to overcome to build this consensus around climate security.
Well, thank you, Katie. And I say everything is still always a work in progress. We're never really quite finished. But I say at the same time, we've made a lot of progress. From in the 90s when I first joined the Department of Defense, environmental issues had the most traction when they were legal requirements. In other words, if a base commander could get fined or go to jail for a violation of the Clean Water Act or for a violation of the Clean Air Act, or you couldn't train because you got an adverse opinion under the Endangered Species Act from the Fish and Wildlife Service, that got people's attention. So when you had the force of law reduced to regulation and enforcement by agencies, people paid attention. And that created sort of requirements in the Department of Defense sense against which you could then begin to reduce those violations, improve your compliance. And also we were closing a lot of bases in that era. So we had legal requirements to clean up those bases. And it was also a presidential mandate because we had a base closure commission and a law that required us to do that. It was a commitment on behalf of President Clinton to communities that was carried out at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. So I'd say, we went from those were kind of shaping forces on environment in that era, although we were beginning to see the environmental ethic evolve within the leadership of the military at the time. I mean, somebody I worked closely with and was very close to was former Army Chief of Staff, General Gordon Sullivan, 25th Secretary of the Army, who really reset the Army after the end of the Cold War. But he was also he would read Rachel Carson, for example, and he was deeply committed sort of to protecting the natural resources on the military bases, and because he saw the intrinsic value of it. He saw that when he was at Fort Leavenworth, there were eagles in the wildlife areas, and that the troops were responsible for protecting them. When Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, had some of its training shut down for failure to protect the red cockaded woodpecker that lives in the longleaf pine tree that dots that base, he and others figured out how they could use the tree as a realistic training obstacle, so they didn't have to cut it down, and they could actually enhance training and protect the ecosystem, the endangered species at the same time. So it was leaders like him and others who kind of could see the vision and could then help lead the services to be able to carry out in a way that you could do both. It wasn't a trade-off, which is what people saw. Now, we moved from that era into the 2000s and into beyond, where both we begin to understand the security implications of climate change, as I just talked about in answer to your first question, and it's moved from being just a legal requirement to really a security requirement. Okay, so now this actually shapes the security environment in which our forces have to operate, whether it's flooded bases or hotter or colder temperatures where our troops deploy, or the fact that aircraft can't take off in the same heat and humidity anymore, or the submarine's profile is affected by the changing acoustics of the ocean. So now, there are real operational components to a changing climate, and also it affects that strategic context in which our forces operate. All of you probably know or have read some of Admiral Stavridis's many books. I think he has a new book out now, The Restless, and he's written novels, 2034, 2054. He's blurred my book too, and his next novel, he told me, is on a climate scenario. Climate and cyber in the Asia Pacific. So again, frontline leaders are now thinking about this in a way that affects all of us.
Incredible. What an evolution of consideration around climate security, and great to hear that some of your compatriots are also publishing books. So where that's concerned, I mean, in the book, you talk about war games around climate that are happening at the Pentagon. You talk about training of military personnel on the climate theme being like a pervasive requirement. You talk about installation preparedness and resilience. Can you talk about, like, stemming from this renewed emphasis on and respect for climate security, what are like the big things that you see as the core pillars of how the DoD and the Pentagon are considering climate security and taking action on it?
Well, all the services and DoD has a climate strategy. They also have climate adaptation plans. Um, so maybe we could kind of break it into, three buckets here. There are the strategic considerations, which we just talked about in sort of the global posture, how it affects our global posture. And within that, there are really two kinds of efforts underway, which is one is war games, to have climate infused, climate realistic war games in every COCOM, and there's that was actually directed in the Defense Authorization Bill. It was one of the DoD's concepts, but it was approved and authorized in the Defense Bill in the last few years as part of this administration's climate plans. And second is to improve our predictive capabilities or our climate intelligence associated with doing both the strategic war games, but it goes to every kind of defense decision making we would have to undertake, which is to close the gap, as DoD says, between the 1 and 10-year gap between short-term weather predictions and longer-term global climate models. If you think of a scale, you've got time and geography. So now you can get reliable weather, in a short, over a short geographic scale that helps us make decisions about when to evacuate for a hurricane, etc. But if you extend that out to what's called seasonal to sub-seasonal forecasting, you extend the time out, and then you extend the geography out, you get less and less fidelity. So what we're trying to do is get fidelity at the shorter time scale. In the shorter year, it's called downscaling global climate models, but then also having it be relevant to different types of decision makers. Every sector of society needs it, not just defense, finance, insurance, banking, agriculture, transportation. And there are various ways to go after that now. I mean, there are private sector companies that are providing some of that climate data analytics. There are government-funded efforts that are trying to do it specifically with, information that's only available in defense and intelligence. And so this is kind of an important part of becoming climate literate. So if we use that as a sort of second phase of this, which is climate adaptation, and DoD has a broad-based climate adaptation strategy, that again has kind of several buckets to it. One is climate resilient infrastructure, so bases. So for example, Tyndall Air Force Base in Hurricane Michael in 2017 had the roofs ripped off the hangars for the F-22 and F-35, and now is being rebuilt as the Air Force's climate resilient base of the future. And it withstood the recent hurricanes Helene and Milton a little bit better than if it had not had that investment. Now, it's not finished, it's a work in progress, so there's more to go. But that both built and natural infrastructure, also it's a coastal area, how you manage the natural infrastructure from reducing beach erosion, restoring mangroves, variety of techniques. So, and then there's also human. So there's not just infrastructure resilience, there's the human component of it, how it affects health of people. And if we talk about health of troops having to deploy in hotter and colder temperatures or train, we have more Black Flag days because of heat now, where troops can't train. We see that particularly at many of our bases in the South and the Southwest. And so they've had to adjust training regimens. Also, you have increased spread of infectious disease. We learned that the hard way in COVID, but we see it more, a variety of different diseases and pathogenic disease, anthropogenic, and also the human animal connection. And then there's also the community-based resilience, because we're not islands. Our water and sewage infrastructure is often interconnected. People live off the base. So when they can't get to work because it's flooded from daily sunny day flooding in Norfolk, that affects the mission as well. Or kids can't get to school. And then lastly, it's about the energy transition. So in the climate strategies for each of the departments, they have goals to be net zero by 2050 and net zero on electricity by 2035. And they're going after that by a variety of techniques. For bases, it's about putting microgrids on that allow you to have distributed more reliable energy sources, and then hook on renewables or waste to energy plants at the first net zero installation in Albany, Georgia, at the Marine Corps logistics base there. They've got waste to energy. They work with the community. Then it's about also looking at how we design our weapon systems. The Air Force's blended body wing aircraft is designed to be 30% more fuel effective, even on existing fuel types, and it will have better mission performance. Because it has reduced aerodynamic drag. So there are some benefits when properly aligned of increasing military effectiveness as we transition in our energy systems.
Amazing. Thank you for overlaying that. Yeah, it's very clear that the resilience and adaptive capacity of these individual installations would, of course, influence people outside the fence line for the reasons you mentioned around water security and energy security, and just resilience to, storms in general. So I think it's a fascinating angle here. One question for you related to this. So relative to the resilience and adaptation plans of individual installations, I know from attending the Climate Resilience Conference the DoD put on last year in St. Louis, which was awesome. And I don't think that you were there. In any event, I know that there are a lot of smart people thinking about this. And I'm curious, what should Americans expect to see in terms of base resilience in the next few years? And what are you hopeful we'll be able to achieve, recognizing, to your point, that adjustments to Air Force bases like Tyndall or MacDill that we saw threatened last week is not finished?
Well, I think you'll see some particular models of climate resilience at, for example, Tyndall, or other mission critical installations that where we're making investments. Parts of Norfolk Naval Base, the largest military base in the world, raising sea levels. I think we'll see a lot. I mean, raising piers to accommodate rising sea levels. I think we will see a lot of innovation. But just to be frank, it won't be uniform, because some places will command more resources, more attention, both because of the criticality of the mission, or some places more recently been subject to a storm or a climate fueled event that has led Congress or DoD to make that investment. It's hard to lift all boats at the same time. That's always challenging, particularly in this area, where when you're talking about MILCON and O&M funding for infrastructure, always lags investment in readiness and training. Readiness is training, but also investment in other accounts. So it's always there's a hard balance. I mean, it's getting more attention today than it has in the past because of these considerations, and because all members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, and that's what I think is important for the Truman family to know, is this has been one of the most bipartisan areas of climate action, because all members of Congress want to keep their military base. They don't want to lose it. So, it doesn't matter if you're in a red state. Tyndall's in Florida, and they want to keep those bases. Now, interesting question arises, and I bring this up in the book. I tell the story about Richard Kidd, who had the position in Department of Defense. It was a version of the job I had in the 90s in installations and environment, who, talked about in certain places we will have military missions that are essential, that regardless of the climate risk, you would, it's important to keep there. For example, Langley Air Force Base down in Norfolk has a mission there to defend the U.S. Capitol. So you've got to keep fighters, within a certain proximity. So even if the runway floods, you'll figure out how to rebuild and shore up that runway. For example, I mean, we're probably not going to move the Naval Academy, even though it also is rebuilding to face increasing sea levels. Fort Stewart in Georgia has a tank training, armored infantry training, and it's increasingly flooding. Could you change the mission there? Maybe it would be light infantry instead of heavy armor, and maybe that would be more compatible with the changing ecosystem. Other places, I mean, it's a good question about MacDill. I mean, it's an Air Force base, but it's also home to Central Command headquarters and SOCOM headquarters. Do you need to keep those big office buildings? Do they have to be there? Now, there's always a lot of considerations in moving anything. So, and this is only one of them, but as the costs increasingly rise, and this goes for the same for civilian communities now, you know, those hard hit in Helene and Milton in parts of Florida and North Carolina are, you know, deciding, should you rebuild in place? Would you be better off? Not that there's really any climate havens left. You know, that's one of the lessons we learned, but people thought Asheville, North Carolina was a climate haven. Turned out not to be. But on the other hand, can you be more resilient in certain other locations?
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. And as you said, we've been seeing in real time this question of how do personnel need to move and change in order to address these climate hazards? Like I think there are I read over 7,000 National Guardsmen deployed for Helene alone in the greater Asheville area. So, you know, we're starting to get entangled with these climate impacts that, as you're saying, they're affecting physical assets, they're affecting missions, they're obviously affecting people. So thanks for those great examples. Zooming back out to the global level, you do a very, very good job in the book of explaining how different regions, like those that you mentioned in your opening remarks, are going to be experiencing climate hazards and how those hazards might influence conflict and general regional instability. You talk about Asia's disaster alley, you talk about the Arctic, you talk about the MENA region in Africa and Central America. And I'm curious, from your personal perspective, Sherri, is there a particular hot button location or zone that you're most concerned about when it comes to climate security?
Oh, well, any of them could keep me up at night. I mean, um, you know, I think all the stresses we're seeing across the Middle East, North Africa are made worse by, I mean, all the conflict stresses are made worse by the climate stresses, and it's hard to disentangle those from the savagery of the ongoing conflicts, um, and that instability. Um, I think, um, you know, to me, some of the issues we'll be seeing in the Arctic are an accident waiting to happen. They're not necessarily, they're a bit like we talked about in the Cold War. We talked about a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union on the U.S. as a low probability, high consequence event, which was worth investing billions of Americans' GDP to defend and deter it. Fortunately, we won that war. You know, I talk about climate change. We write about climate change as being a high probability, high consequence event, and yet our investment, because it runs across a lot of different domains of society, not one agency responsibility. It's really not. It's not the military. You know, the military has a mission. It's not going to solve the global climate challenge. It can only get its own house in order and be ready to be responsible to the threats on the horizon, which now include climate. But in the Arctic, you know, you have almost an accident waiting to happen. Now, it won't necessarily be World War III, but it could be a very devastating ecological disaster if you have an oil spill or a collision in the shallow Arctic waters. We don't really have a lot of experience anywhere in cleaning up a big Arctic oil spill. It could make Exxon Valdez or Deepwater Horizon look easy. And plus, we know that the Russians have never been forthright about really a lot of things under Putin, but even historically, about their own nuclear risk, from Chernobyl to the sinking of the Kursk submarine, where all the sailors were lost, and even the Russians didn't know for a long time exactly what happened to those young men aboard that submarine. So, there's a lot a lot of unknown unknowns in those kind of scenarios that you could play out occurring in that region. I could spit out more scenarios, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, that gives us a lot to think about alone. And it sounds like from what you're saying, just the introduction of potential miscommunication or misunderstanding or, brushing forces could lead to, it sounds like, some sort of cataclysmic or problematic conflict. Yeah. Wow. Definitely something to contemplate. Related to that, Sherri, so often kind of in the national security community, of course, we hear many, many people talking about great power competition between the United States and Russia and China in particular. And many times those voices claim that those problems and those conflicts potentially or competition should really be our sole focus, and things like climate security just don't matter as much. What are those people missing? How do you see climate security kind of intersecting these topics of great power competition?
right. Well, I mean, I've said this. I mean, Kath Hicks, our deputy secretary, said this, some version of it, even yesterday in remarks she gave at CSIS. We think about China as the pacing threat for our force posture in the United States, but climate is the shaping threat, because it's the context in which we will have to operate. We now do exercises where a stronger typhoon, in the Pacific could knock out communications and give China an opening to act in the region, as well as, complicated, of course, by cyber attacks and other other compound threats. So it is one that has to be accounted for in a very real operational sense. So it's not an either or. You have to be able to walk and chew gum. I mean, that's what I say. Yeah, you have to do both. Our military's always had to do both, respond to multiple risks at the same time. And it is really, in essence, a risk management issue. That's why I think it was, even when politics have been polarized on climate, in the military, it's about managing across a whole range of risks. And this is just one of them. And as General Sullivan said, we never wait for 100% certainty, because if you wait for 100% certainty, something bad is going to happen on the battlefield. You have contingencies and you plan against a range of probabilities. And now we've seen the probabilities increase of climate threats over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense, the yes and approach. And I thought it was fascinating that in your book and some of your subsequent interviews, you've actually talked about how if the United States doesn't pick up the mantle of driving clean energy and climate resilience, we're abdicating a leadership opportunity that could actually entice some allies in the Asian, kind of Pacific region, who might enable us to engage in more successful great power competition. So a really, really interesting set of points there. Thank you. Yeah. So my next question for you, switching gears a little bit, is, I think that generally speaking, there are a lot of people in the greater Truman community who are concerned, understandably, that, although climate change is inevitably going to be intensifying, we see, based on today's kind of political landscape, that it's not a given that elected officials are going to acknowledge climate change, and it's not a given that they're going to acknowledge climate security. So how do you view having a policy or belief in climate science as being linked to protecting the American people? How do you see kind of that concept? And how do you think about sort of not only our current political circumstance where this is concerned, but also this upcoming election?
Well, it's always a challenge when people are subjected to lies and can't sort the wheat from the chaff. And, we have a lot of that mis and disinformation throughout society now. And, a lot of it happening in the context of the election, and we see the dis and misinformation, the lies being perpetrated around, what FEMA is doing, for example, in responding to Helene and Milton. And that's also sort of undermines trust and faith in government and in institutions, which is really, really, for me, that's deeply troubling. I mean, the whole through line of my book is about the importance of public service and institutions, and it's kind of how I was raised and what I believe in, and why it merits, why why it's important to serve, whether you serve in uniform or outside or in the adjacent, in the private sector even, but it's important to care about making the world a better place. But now we see so much trying to erode trust in public institutions as a political strategy. And look, so I mean that's what happened. That's what enabled Hitler to come to power. But we should always be mindful of that. You know, my parents are Holocaust refugees from Germany, and they were among the fortunate few who were able to leave in the 1930s, but many didn't get out. And why did anti-Semitism rise up so much, and why was Hitler able to sort of turn a whole society against people, and take advantage? It's because he eroded trust in those public institutions, and that's happening right now. So people have to have their eyes wide open.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in the paradigm that you're talking about, where we know that the stakes could not be higher with this upcoming election, you've often spoken about, and you do in your book, about sort of the checks and balances and the various levers within Washington and beyond, whether it's Congress or it's think tanks like Truman or others, or it's the DoD that collectively enable action on things like climate security. When you think about addressing leaders in the NatSec community, generally speaking, or the Truman community, how would you counsel people to think about using those levers and talking about climate security in such a politically polarized time?
Well, I always come back to the mission and to readiness of our forces, because no one argues that we shouldn't enable our troops to be ready to deploy in all kinds of conditions, or that they should be properly man-trained and equipped, and that our bases should be ready. So, I mean, that's even if so that I think enables the greatest common ground when there are disputes, and that's why you see the greatest level of bipartisan action on the defense bill. It's largely in the areas of protecting military bases and protecting forces. I see here a question which I will kind of answer as I turn. About climate skeptics sometimes raise concerns about the energy transition harming military readiness capabilities. Can you speak to some of the benefits? So, yeah, I think the energy transition is a little bit of the harder piece. It's a little harder politically than infrastructure-based resilience, and troops and personnel readiness. What I would say there is it's not about going cold turkey from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So no one should think that that's happening, because it's not. I mean, look, we're going to still be using fossil fuels in the military and in societies at large for a long time. But can you decarbonize, and can you, as the question implies, in certain cases, you can gain greater military effectiveness? The deputy secretary and others talk about, and I share this in the book, that hybrid tactical vehicles on the battlefield are both quieter, and you talk about lower heat signatures, they're quieter, and they've improved torque. So why wouldn't you use them if you have the right kind of batteries? Why wouldn't you use a hybrid vehicle? Because you get improved military effectiveness. And so where you can get that double or triple benefit in the transition from effective, again, it's more about the mission than emissions. On the energy transition, it's about keeping our troops out of harm's way in trucking fuel to the front. And it's also about having flexibility in your supply lines in a contested logistics environment. So it's not about going green for green's sake, and it's not primarily about the emissions, but there are benefits to being able to take a clear-eyed view of what the choices are, and as I said, in the blended body wing aircraft, for example, that design has 30% improved effectiveness and better aerodynamics. So that's also a benefit.
Great. And thanks for that question, Ian. If other people have questions, please feel free to stick them in the chat and we'll take a look at them. On a related note, Sherri, for those that are not aware of the tie between, threats to troops and mortality and fuel convoys, I think that this is a point that strikes right at the heart of what you're talking about around decarbonization actually leading to mission readiness. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the threats that are posed by delivering fossil fuels abroad to our military installations and to our troops, and how an acknowledgement of the risk there is driving change in decarbonization.
Yeah, well, I mean, this effort started already well over 10 years, 15 years ago at the height of our deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, when General then Secretary Mattis said, unleash us from the tether of fuel. And he wasn't talking about going green. What he was talking about was reducing the IED attacks that soldiers and Marines were subject to when they were trucking fuel to the front. And 8 out of 10 of the military convoys are fuel, water, and ammunition. And then guarding the big bases like Bagram and others. I tell the story in the book of Mike Henshin, who was, was taking his life, and risking his life every time he had to check, a new truck loaded with logistics coming on base because it might explode. And so, the more we can reduce risk to our troops, the better off we'll be. And so it's all about reducing risk. And that's, finding ways to have portable and secure power, from a variety of sources, or portable and secure water. Now you can sometimes make water from out of air in remote locations. So, I mean, there are all these new advanced technologies, and the military, has to be able to harness them for its purposes.
Definitely. Yeah, we at Tailwind, we're invested in a company called Cryogenics, which has like a defibrillator for heat. It's like a vest you put on someone when they're about to die of heat stroke. And so to your point about new technology, it seems like there are just myriad ways that, people in the private sector and business community could think about, to your point, deploying products in such a way that it enables our mission readiness.
Right.
Yeah. So on another note, as we kind of wrap up here, I wanted to ask you another question about, kind of climatizing security, as you call it. There are a lot of areas, I think, of the climate community wherein there's some criticism of the Department of Defense potentially securitizing climate. I'm interested in what your response to that might be.
Well, you already gave me my answer there, Katie, because
I blew it.
I flipped it around. There is this academic school of securitization of X. It securitization of climate is just one, but there's some. I think it's called a Danish school. It started 25, 30 years ago, and I mean, to me, these are academics in an ivory tower who don't really know how the real world works, because again, it's not about securitizing climate. It's all that we've talked about here today is about having a more climate aware, climate ready military. And again, no one is saying, I've never said that I think the military is the answer to the global climate challenge. The military can't solve that. It's only at best, even in the US, where we're a large energy user, about 1% of total energy use. So the solutions, for example, sustainable aviation fuels, which is all these hard to decarbonize sectors of the economy. The innovation is happening in the commercial and the private sector, where, the military, maybe the Air Force, can be a partner with the airlines that are developing the SAF, but they're not the lead, right? They can maybe be an off-taker for a military relevant version of that SAF. That's the way the military is relevant. So that's on the energy side. Then, in the form of security cooperation, increasingly, security cooperation has to be climate, and security assistance has to be climate relevant. I mean, I just spent my last talk right before this was with the group of mid-level, mostly uniformed and civil service students in the DoD sponsored Syracuse Maxwell course for executive leadership. And I gave a version of this talk, and I'd say about half of the group are National Guard. And I want to ask them, what are you seeing as National Guard increasingly deployed on the front lines of climate emergencies in the US and overseas? So, our National Guard participates in the state partnership program. So not only do our Guard and Reserve get called up much more frequently for fires, floods, and hurricanes in the US, but they're mostly all in each state that assigned one or more state partner. So, for example, the head of the Vermont National Guard said, we've got Senegal, Austria, and Macedonia. So we are deploying for flooding in Austria and Macedonia, in Senegal for other kinds of exercises. Another one said, we're working, with Haiti and Belize. Louisiana goes to Belize a lot. They're trying to engage with Haiti. That's harder. And then particularly in our COCOMs that don't come with their own indigenous forces, particularly Southcom, they rely very heavily on our state partnership programs through the National Guard to provide and supplement the forces. And, what's challenging is that, and I said, so what's your biggest problem? They said, well, manning, funding, and time, because the demand signals keep growing, but they're not always sufficiently resourced to undertake these missions. So I think that's a story that has to be more widely told within defense circles to help. These are our what I'd say are weekend warriors. Some of them activated, but they're doing jobs in the civilian world, but giving back to our country and overseas. And they have to deploy in these changing conditions, and they're trying to build that trust and cooperation that is so important that we need, because at the end of the day, our foreign policy, our national security, our strength comes from our allies and partners. That's where we have an edge at the end of the day over China and Russia, is because we have those allies and partners from NATO to the Indo-Pacific, to Latin America and beyond. And we have to nurture those relationships. They don't just happen overnight. And sometimes it's in boring conference rooms, or it's in doing, simple training exercises, or doing educational programs. I mean, I go to NDU regularly and speak to the groups of military and Guard and civilian students who come from various countries of Latin America, to the Perry Center or to the other centers. And those are really, I think those are important anchors in our security, and we shouldn't underestimate the value of that. And
Absolutely.
I would
Yeah.
encourage Truman folks to get active in those kinds of programs too, because also they're really fun and you meet people from around the world.
That's great. So many important ideas in there, Sherri. Obviously around the importance of international collaboration and strengthening ties with allies and collaborating on these climate security topics. I wanted to double click on the point you made about deployment of our National Guard, which is of course a super, super important service, into other countries to help them deal with climate hazards. I know that you've been very involved in the Council on Strategic Risks and the Center for Climate and Security, and just looking at the tracker they've developed of military deployments, right, for climate hazards, it's stunning. I don't think it's something that's obvious to almost anyone. It certainly wasn't to me.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a very good piece of research and analysis there, the MIRCH, Military Response Climate Tracker. So I would recommend it to everyone if you want to follow this. I'm sure some of you already use it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we need to wrap up. I want to first say thank you so much for all your thoughts and remarks today, and for your leadership on this topic, for enabling us to be able to have such a robust conversation at this day and age on climate security in the United States. You've done so much to bring that forward, and we're so thankful for all that leadership. I also just want to shamelessly plug your book before I give you one last opportunity to address this audience, and say that it's fantastic. It covers a range of, as you've heard today, very challenging topics, but with an ease and with a quality of writing that's fantastic. I think I told Sherri I read it at the beach. So highly recommend purchasing and reading Threat Multiplier. Finally, Sherri, I'll turn it back to you for closing remarks. What would you like to leave our audience with today?
Well, first, I hope you will buy the book, and I hope to see you in person so I can sign it for you if that interests you. I do think this is an area where, I mean, no one's part of Truman unless you want to make a difference. Otherwise, you wouldn't be bothered. You'd go off and do something else. So, I do think this is an area that's getting increasing attention from leadership across the department, across government, and of course in the private sector. The kind of work you're doing, Katie, is equally important, because we've got to get that investment going in the companies, in the innovation that's going to bring us that more climate and energy secure future. So, I'd say I hope you find your own path that's meaningful, where you feel you can make a difference. And it's not always a straight path across your career. I'll just say, you can, I can look back now and I feel like, oh yeah, okay, I did, I made a difference. Okay, here, but I didn't always feel that way. Nobody does. So, they say that the days are long, but the years are short. That's what they say about having kids. So now that my kids are all grown, so you can't get that time back. So use your time well, but enjoy all parts of your life, and try to make what you find to be a meaningful contribution.
Amazing. Thank you so much, and great to see you, Sherri. And thanks to the Truman Center and all of you that joined us today. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you, Tony. Thanks to my Truman friends and family on this call. I really appreciate it.
See ya.
Okay. Bye all.